I'm Scott,
And I'm Sylvie
and welcome to Low Carb.
for longevity.
We'd like to introduce a very special guest today, Dr. Tony Hampton.
I am so happy to be here, guys.
I kind of wish we were still in the Caribbean, but that's okay.
Yeah,
And
I
say
think
hi
we
to
I think we
Crawley.
all do. I think we all do. That was a good time having a low carb cruise together and being stuck with each other in the corner of a corner table, but it was the funnest corner I've ever been in.
That's
So
nice. Thanks for the
it-
compliment, Tony. Can we start by getting you to introduce yourself, your education, your credentials, and what you're involved with in the Chicago area?
yeah, well, I am a family doctor. I am board certified not only in family medicine but obesity medicine. I was crazy enough to go and get a master's in nutrition and functional medicine. And the functional medicine part helps to understand the root cause of disease. So, um, so I have a Protecting Your Nest podcast, and the NEST and ROPE acronym are the foundations of the functional. Uh, it's the roots of the functional. It's a tree they have, and it has roots. So it's a functional medicine tree with roots, and the roots are the root cause of why we get sick. So that's how you kind of message it. In Chicago, I have roles as a leader, and I'm in a large health system called Advocate Health. And we recently were given the organization is going to dedicate $1 billion to the South Side of Chicago to build a new hospital, as well as uh, 10 clinics that support that hospital embedded in YMCAs and churches, community centers, with the goal of keeping people out of the hospital. So it'll be interesting. So my goal and my role hopefully will be to help teach metabolic health so that we can heal people so they won't have to go to the hospital. So that's kind of what I'm up to now. And I really love spreading this message that you can heal. You don't have to be chronically ill if you just change what you put in your mouth.
Thank you so much for everything you do, Dr. Tony. Your contribution to the health system in your city is wonderful. You're a saint, and your patients and your colleagues are so lucky to have you.
I want to give a little shout out too because Dr. Tony Hampton is going to be part of a documentary
Mhm.
called Healing Humanity. We are wearing the Meat Heals Carb
Carb
Steel.
Steel.
That's right.
Shout out to Carrie Mann on that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, Kerry has done a great job of, he's a homesteader, so he has a Homestead How YouTube channel, and he was just teaching homesteading types of concepts. He ended up learning about carnivore. Everything got better. In particular, he talks about his mental health getting better, and he was so inspired by that he decided to work with a few other people to create a documentary. And I just really appreciate him, Adam, Alia, who are part of that team. And they have probably around, I don't know, 10 or so docs that are going to be part of it. People like Dr. Ken Berry, Dr. Anthony Chafee, Dr. Georgia E., Dr. Lisa Weideman,
All of our
and
heroes.
others. Just wonderful people, man. And because when we have things like the documentaries that talk about the blue zones, which are not plant-based, by the way,
Mhm.
we need to have a balancing conversation and let people know that you can heal by eating an animal-based diet. So I'm really excited about that, and hopefully they'll get it in front of a lot of people
Yeah.
so we can give permission to people to eat an animal-based diet without fear. And it takes, experts who can say, yeah, animal-based is okay. In fact, not only is it okay, you may thrive better if you eat that way. And that's why I think we're all interested in this way of eating.
Mhm.
We're super excited for that coming out. So,
Right on.
yeah. So there's a lot of confusion out there regarding nutrition. How would the average person navigate through all of this?
Yeah, and I want to apologize to the world for all the confusion. Um, when I got this extra training, it was to really learn biochemistry and understand how. Remind me, Professor, how does the body really work? And the problem is, no matter what I learn in school, industry will impact what we learn
Mhm.
because they want to
Mm,
sell a product. We have dietary guidelines that'll tell you to eat. I remember that food pyramid that said you should eat, um, 7 to 8 servings of, grains, and I
yeah.
mean, and 8 to 10 servings of fruits and vegetables. And if half of it is fruit, that's a lot of sugar. Fruit is nature's candy. If I do 7 to 8 servings of grains in the form of cereal and pasta, that's a whole lot of sugar. And so the guidelines confuse us. And if we then rely on research studies that are observational, meaning a survey came to your house, you filled it out and sent it back, that's not really good sources of information. If there's a social media influencer, which you guys are becoming and I've been doing, right? If they're not using evidence based information, then the average person is going to be confused. So, what do you do? Well, the
Mhm.
first thing you do is you make sure when they quote a study, was it a randomized controlled trial? If it wasn't,
Mhm.
you can show possible association and correlation, but you can't show cause and effect. So, you can't make life changing decisions based on observational studies. If you're trying to go into a dietary pattern like keto and or carnivore, you try to keep it clean. So avoid doing a dirty keto if you can. Instead, eat nutrient rich foods. You shop on the outside of the grocery store and you eat animals and non-starchy sides. Keep it simple. And if you don't believe anything we're saying, invest in a continuous glucose meter and stop eating the stuff that spikes your sugar. If it
Mhm.
spikes your sugar, tomorrow I won't eat that. And if you do that for a couple of months, by the end of a couple of months, you'll know what to eat. So we don't have to play scientist or doctor or influencer like you guys. What we can do is say, what does that meter say? And rather you have diabetes or not, you don't want to have sugar spikes leading to too much insulin, which will make you sick. So that's kind of how I would frame it. I understand why people are confused. And I feel like I'm a little bit more of authority because I have a, board certified in obesity medicine, I have a master's in nutrition. But honestly, that's not the key. The key is that when I put something in front of you, trust but verify. And
Nice.
then that way you'll be able to make better decisions.
That's awesome. You touched on a lot of different things that I probably would have wanted to ask you about, and may not necessarily have done so. So thanks for that thorough answer.
No problem.
So I remember through through our interactions before, and you've shared it before in your podcast in the past, that you were previously plant based. So I'm curious to know what led you to a plant based diet, and then what led you away from it.
Well, I fell into a rabbit hole. I did a Google search and I wanted to make sure my babies were healthy and how to disease proof your kids popped up. I think Dr. Furman wrote that book, and he was a plant based doctor. And once you type in Dr. Furman on a Google search, you get Dr. Ornish, you get Dr.
Oh,
Esselstein, you get
okay.
all these other plant based doctors, and that becomes your YouTube feed. And you become indoctrinated in that way of thinking. And I think the world in general, even in 2025,
Mhm.
will promote plant-based diets as the healthiest uh, diet. It'll also say that's the diet to protect the environment. Oh, that's the diet to be morally ethical to our animals. So I kind of fell into that, and I didn't understand that there was a way to be morally ethical to my animals if I do regenerative farming. There's a oh, by the way, only 2% of cow burps are impacting the environment. There are probably some other things that are more significant than 2%.
Mhm.
And oh, by the way, meat can be healthy. So I had to re-educate myself. And I'll be clear, I did get better with my irritable bowel, which was the health condition I suffered with, on a plant-based diet compared to the standard American diet. But
Yeah.
guess what? I was still gassy. I was
Mm.
still bloated. And guess what? The gas goes away when you're a carnivore. The bloating goes away when
It
you're a
does.
carnivore. It goes
I
away.
can attest to that.
Amen. And I'm glad that you didn't have gas when we were on this low carb cruise, and I didn't either. Amen.
Yeah, I was burning jet fuel.
So, and not to mention, as a doctor, isn't it nice to have the energy to be a doctor? Isn't it nice to
Mhm.
have the mental clarity? All of those things. Oh, or not have to worry about lunch if you don't want to eat lunch because
Right.
you feel full.
Or you don't have
So
time.
exactly. You're busy.
Yeah.
So my body just responded better to animal-based diet. And when I was plant-based, I was worried about B12 and zinc and iron and all these other vitamins. But on the animal-based diet, all I have to worry about is making sure I got a steak in front of me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I kind of went from low carb, keto, and now I'm more carnivore, but I also give my permission to indulge if I choose to. I need to just be metabolically healthy. And as long as I'm metabolically healthy, I'll be the best version of Tony. I'll be mentally clear. I'll be able to do the things I need to do, including spending time with you guys. I'll have time at the end of the day for my wife. If my sons need counseling or, father like, advice, I can give it to them. So all of these things happen when you are eating the proper human diet.
Mm.
And one of the most important things you can eat is meat.
Yeah.
Agreed.
And and meat is anything that walked, crawled, or swam or flew. If
Hmm.
it was alive, that's what meat is to me. And that's a better source of nutrients than other sources, like from plants.
Perfect.
It's delicious.
That's right.
So Tony, we've been told, I don't want to say brainwashed necessarily, but it's been ingrained in us since we were children to eat our vegetables, eat the rainbow. Otherwise, we're not going to be healthy. So,
That's
what's
right.
your response to that notion? And are there really toxins in plants that can negatively impact our health?
Well, my response is rainbows are beautiful. And whenever it's raining and I see a rainbow, I say, wow, I'm like a little kid. Wow, look at that. But rainbows are not necessary to achieve metabolic health. If I were to use one example, and I spoke of the food pyramid in the past, most people would say fruit is a perfect thing to consume because it helps you make a complete rainbow on your plate.
Mhm.
But is it the best diet if I had that continuous glucose meter on me for my diabetes? If I eat a banana, which is 28 carbs for a medium banana, and divided by 4 is 7 teaspoons of sugar, is that the best thing to feed my wife who has type 1 diabetes?
Hmm.
Mm.
I would argue it's not. And I've done videos where I've shared things like oatmeal spikes your sugar more than a Snickers bar. Because the Snickers
Wow.
bar isn't that crazy? A
Yeah.
Snicker
That's
bar has
crazy.
protein and fat, and if you look at a protein, fat, carb graph, you'll see that the protein spikes a little bit, and the fat doesn't hardly spike at all. So if I have something with 3 things in it, that'll mitigate, it'll blunt that spike, where the oatmeal or the banana is basically just all carbs. So vegetables have nutrients. 100, if you just break it down in the lab, but it also has oxalates and
Mhm.
lectins and phytates, and these are what we call anti-nutrients. These are things that inhibit the absorption of the exact same nutrients that you thought you were getting.
Wow.
Oh, by the way, they can irritate you and cause inflammation to certain individuals. So while we can tolerate vegetables,
Mhm.
we tend to thrive eating animal based. And so eating from the rainbow is not really evidence based because it doesn't really answer the question, is that the best diet for the person who has poor metabolic health? Oh, by the way, only about 7% of Americans have good metabolic health, and it's probably the same in Canada. So if that's
For
true,
sure.
then I need to avoid the things that can spike my sugar. The steak, the ground beef, the fish, the salmon, the eggs, they will not spike your blood sugar. So for me, vegetables are okay for those who tolerate them.
Hmm.
But for
Mm-hmm.
most people should lean more towards an animal-based diet and indulge periodically in plants. And if you eat plants regularly, ketovore, then you need to eat the non-starchy vegetables because greens and spinach and cabbage only have 1 to 2 or 3 carbs.
Right.
That won't be a problem as long as you're not eating it with cornbread. Amen. Amen.
You reminded me of a little experience that I had because we used to grow our own garden here. So we had
Oh,
some
yes.
fresh beets out of the garden,
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
and
absolutely.
I was advised to eat beets for my blood pressure.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And and when we were on the standard North American diet, well, we were eating a lot of garbage and drinking a lot of garbage. And for example, a soda was one of those things that we used to drink. Um, and having a glucose monitor, I could easily see the impact that drinking a soda would have, but also eating a high glycemic vegetable. And lo and behold, I eat 3 small beets that were freshly boiled on the stove, and didn't it drive
Mm,
my glucose way higher than a can of Pepsi?
yeah. Isn't that crazy?
It was crazy. It
And
was
that's why
eye
you need to
opening.
do the experiment.
Yeah.
You do the experiment, and beets may not be as bad as rice. I mean, it's probably 13 or 15 carbs for a cup of beets. But again, you have to ask yourself, are there better options? So when my patients, beets have been found to be helpful for blood pressure, but I'll tell my patients, get you some beet capsules if you just want to do
Right.
beets. And then you can
Okay.
eliminate the sugar
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
that comes with beets typically in that way. Because I think hypertension is it's a metabolic disease and it's primarily a sugar disease. It's not a salt disease. And most
Right.
people don't know that. Yeah,
No. Yeah. We've had our share of discussions to try to clarify that issue.
that's right. Absolutely.
Coming back to your oats, because I remember at one point I would do the overnight oats because they were pretty and they were fun every time I ate them, and I was eating them because of the fiber. But
Yes.
like an hour after, my belly felt so bad.
Yes.
So let's talk about fiber a little bit. Like we're mostly carnivore. Is a lot of people ask us, well, what about
Yeah.
Mm,
fiber?
Where are you going to get your fiber?
Yeah, is that
that's right.
necessary?
Well, I apologize to my professors at University of Western States who I earned a master's from because they would argue fiber is pretty important. So even when I got my master's in nutrition, I had to question conventional thinking. And so I so fiber, first of all, if fiber was a problem for constipation, I would be in trouble. In fact, we all would.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Um, but I can say out loud that as the young folks say, I do number two with no problem.
Right.
Yeah.
So on its face, it doesn't make sense. I did a video. If somebody searches Dr. Tony Hampton fiber on YouTube,
Yep.
I did a video that highlighted the World Journal of Gastroenterology, and they published a paper in 2012, I think it was, and they did a study where they kind of reduced fiber in one part of the cohort, they stopped fiber in another, and then they had a group that kept eating fiber, and they found that the group that ate the fiber was the group that had the abdominal cramping, the
Mm-hmm.
bloating,
Mm-hmm.
the symptoms, and the people that had zero fiber had none of those symptoms. So fiber being promoted as something that we need is it falls flat on its face because your body really doesn't absorb it, and adding more bulk is why you have uh, that bloating sensation. And when I made the video, I said adding more cars to the expressway is not going to make the traffic flow better. It's going to give you some symptoms, but I doubt that it's going to help. Now, are there examples of people who do better on fiber? Absolutely. But to say fiber is essential for regularity. It's not essential for Dr. Hampton. It's not essential for Scott. It's not essential for Sylvie.
No.
And it's not essential for a lion or a tiger or a bear who's eating salmon primarily with zero fiber. So it's just, it falls flat on its face. So I think, again, if you consume fiber and that you feel it benefits you, have at it. But for me, I find that it only irritates my gut. That chariness, think of it as like little chari.
Yeah.
It disrupts the lining of your gastrointestinal system. And then you get a leaky
Mm-hmm.
gut, right? Which you've heard of. And that leaky gut will then help you absorb things you shouldn't, larger proteins that shouldn't be absorbed. And now you increase your risk for autoimmune diseases and a whole slew of other issues. So it's best to understand how the body works and know that you don't need this non-essential nutrient to be healthy.
Agreed.
Yeah, I know I do better without the fiber.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can give us your opinion on why these days meat, especially red meat, is so demonized.
Yeah. Well, I feel so bad about that because I wouldn't be able to wear that nice shirt you guys are wearing. So, yeah. Well, I think it's mostly going back to what I said. When I said observational studies,
Mm,
observational research, which only show correlation and causation,
Mm-hmm.
I will admit that sometimes we don't have access to randomized controlled trials, but it's those studies that have created a lot of confusion. And then they'll see a study like that, and then and there may be a slight increase if we were to use the World Health Organization that looked at studies, and they found that people who eat 5 pieces of bacon every day for the rest of their lives will increase their cancer risk by 18%, right?
yeah, we've
That's
heard
the
that.
world. Yeah. But first of all, it was based on observational studies, which does not show cause and effect. So you already can just ignore it.
Yeah.
But if you did believe it, with that, your risk for colon cancer, as an example, is 5%. Your risk for colon cancer, if you eat 5 pieces of bacon every day for the rest of your life, goes to 5.9%. That's what that 18% represents. If you say
Okay.
18% of
Okay.
5%, right? So if that's true, then you have to ask yourself, am I going to eat the bacon or not eat the bacon based on that 5 going to 5.9? And if you ask most people, they'll say that doesn't sound like a compelling argument
Right.
based on studies that were poor quality. So that's the first issue, is this cancer concern. The second issue is the concern around saturated fat. This has been debunked. Shout out to the people from the past, like Ansel Keys, for killing millions of people because he told us saturated fat was harmful. So we went from fat to more carbs. Thank you, Ansel Keys. But
Mhm.
thankfully, the Journal of the American College of Cardiology has debunked this. They looked at not just these observational studies that are poor quality, they looked at the randomized trials. And when they looked at the randomized trials, they found that not only does red meat not correlate to heart disease and increased mortality, it does not. They found that it was protective against stroke. So now we're saying eat a steak, eat the egg, eat those things, and you'll reduce your risk for stroke. That's an interesting, amazing
Yeah.
thing. And the other piece is meat is more bioavailable. So if you're trying to get iron and B12 and these other essential amino acids and nutrients, you will be able to absorb them better if they're in the form of animal protein. So a lot of this is bias. A lot of this is misinformation. Our job is to say to people, did you not know that the Journal of the College of Cardiology has put out a position statement about this? You can just Google it.
Mm-hmm.
Journal of College of Cardio, position statement on fat. And it'll just pop up and you're like, oh, I didn't know that. Maybe I should share this with my doctor. So anybody can do that. And by doing that, we will then have new information that may eventually convince a doctor who's been saying saturated fat is harmful for their entire career that we have new information that says that's not true.
Right.
And even back then, when we were learning from Ansel Keys, this is what he was trying to teach.
Mm-hmm.
There's the Minnesota Heart Study
Right.
that already rebuked this stuff, but they
Yes.
put it in the closet because they didn't want you to know the truth. Because once you put your ideology out there, it's embarrassing to have another ideology that goes against you. It's not embarrassing if you're a true scientist. True scientists want to have debate because is the goal to be right or is the goal to help people heal?
Right.
Our job is to spread this information so that the people watching this episode heal and then their families heal. We're not trying to win a prize. We're trying to help people heal.
Excellent examples, Tony, and thanks for putting it in that way, a way that people can easily understand, and the examples that you give that people can research. And we encourage people to do their own research, and you won't
Yes.
often hear that from medical professionals. They think doing your own research is silly, and Google searches are silly, but if you know how to validate and fact check the information you're finding, then eventually it will lead you to the truth, and that's what we're here to do. And it's funny, the example of correlation and not causation that always comes to mind is an example that I saw where there was a large dented roof, and there was a cat sitting in the lowest part of the dent of this roof, and correlation would tell you that the cats dent roofs, when in fact, that's an epidemiological study, uh, and most likely there was another cause. Maybe a tree fell on that roof previously. So that goes to tell us that maybe in those studies that say meat causes cancer, that those people that were surveyed were also smokers and eating a lot
Right.
of fast food, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe drinking a little too much alcohol. So to have a controlled, randomized, controlled study to wade through those silly correlations and correlative examples might be of value, just to clarify those examples.
So you talked about saturated fat a lot, but when everybody was on this low fat diet, which some people are still on a low fat diet, we seem to have switched from saturated fats to mostly seed oils, replace them with seed oils. Are those, you hear a lot about seed oils. A lot of people say they're safe, and other people say they're not safe. What would you say in regards to seed oils?
I think we're still evolving in our knowledge. There are some studies that make you pause and really worry about seed oils. There are other studies that don't. So I'm very logical about how I look at these things. So for me, I say to myself, there's controversy. So what should you do when there's controversy? I I use logic at that point until we get more science. So, and what I'm finding is if I have an option, I use the mnemonic. I like acronyms. So I say BOCA, which means mouth in Spanish.
Oh.
This little tip: butter or ghee, olive oil, coconut oil, avocado oil.
Mm.
They're pretty much either coming from the cow naturally, minimally processed, or they're cold pressed. So if I take a olive oil or avocado oil and it's just cold pressed and the oil comes out, that sounds a little safer than taking a seed and not the vegetable itself, but the seed of a vegetable. And then I have to use a lot of chemicals to turn that into a oil. And then what happens is, and we've heard terms like omega 3. Most people are aware omega 3 sounds more positive,
Yeah.
and omega 6, too much of that can be negative. And it's more of a ratio, and you don't want to go too crazy. You need both.
Mhm.
But if you
Okay.
have too much of the six, and what happens with vegetable oils, you get too much of the sixes. So now you have inflammation in your body and something called oxidative stress. So at the end of the day, you're more likely, in my mind, to have problems if you consume these vegetable oils, which are basically seed oils, as opposed to cold pressed ingredients like an olive. And that's a better model. So until the research is definitive, I would tell patients and anybody checking us out, eat something that's minimally processed. You're more likely to do better with that.
And ultimately, that's the goal when looking at everything that we eat,
That's
is to
right.
try to eliminate anything that's processed. And if you look at the process of processing these seed oils, most people don't
Mm.
understand what that looks like. And if you were to compare it to anything, it might remind you of an oil refinery that makes petroleum fuel.
Exactly.
The process is just as complex and troubling as all that.
That's right.
Mm.
Many steps to that process. And so if people, literally did a Google search or go to YouTube and say, how do they make vegetable oils? What's the process? You may find it very interesting and disappointing since they consider this health food.
Right. So I think it's pretty common knowledge that on a plant-based diet, that supplementation is an absolute must. How would you compare that to a whole food, low glycemic diet where we're prioritizing animal protein, or even a carnivore diet? Would you suggest that supplementation is required to maintain good health on a way of eating like that?
My short answer is no. Um, my longer answer is that because animal-based protein is more bioavailable, the nutrients that are naturally in this food are going to be easy for your body to have access to. So we know that people who are plant-based may have to, supplement with B12 as an example. They tend to have less iron. And again, you only absorb 2% of the iron that's in spinach and maybe 30% to 40% of the iron in meat.
Wow.
So even though
Wow.
it's crazy, so you can eat a whole lot you can hang out with Popeye the Sailor Man if you want to. Shout out to Olive, what's her name? The Olive,
Olive, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Shout
Olive
out to
oil.
all of
We
them.
call her olive oil.
That big brute guy, all of them. Shout out to all of them. But if you're hanging out with them, then you may have to supplement if you're eating spinach. Just eat a little liver once a week or some beef, you'll be fine.
Mm.
Hmm.
So the first part is you're going to get all those essential things, so you don't have to supplement. Carbohydrates have the word hydrate in there. It attracts water in your body, and it attracts with it salt, potassium, magnesium. When you get rid of carbohydrates,
Okay.
particularly when you first start, you may get rid of magnesium, potassium, and sodium.
Mm.
During that adaptation phase, you may find it helpful for some people, particularly if you're going from standard American diet to carnivore or keto. You may have to supplement, but then your body course corrects. And you'll know that you're fine if you're not having cramps and things like that, right? If you're cramping, you probably are not getting enough salt. So we try to make sure we salt. We're the opposite of the rest of the world. We're saying eat a lot of fat. We're
Yes.
saying put a lot of salt on your food. And people look
Yeah.
at
Quality
it like
salt.
right, quality salt like Redmond's,
Hmm.
Hmm.
which has minerals and other stuff in it. And if you do that really well, you are not likely to have any deficiencies. Now, I keep Keto Chow's salt tea, one of the companies that, because I just want to have it available just
Hmm.
in case I need it. Some people take it every day. I take it as needed. The only supplements I take personally is I take omega-3 because I personally don't eat a lot of seafood. Do I like seafood? Yes, I just don't eat it on a regular basis.
Hmm.
Hmm.
So a high quality omega-3 for those who don't like seafood, maybe a night, a good idea. And then I do vitamin D3 K2 because, I live in Chicago. It's like 7 degrees outside right now, and
Yeah.
it's hard to get enough sun. So I think most people on an animal-based diet don't need to supplement, but if you do, you'll probably just be looking at electrolytes. That's a far cry from the types of labs I see in my clinic for plant-based people, where they tend to become deficient in all kinds of stuff because you have to be pretty smart to combine the
Mm-hmm.
vegetables properly so you get the
Right.
the amino acids you need. Egg has all the essential amino acids,
Mm.
but you can't find a plant that's got everything in one item. It doesn't exist. You have to then combine things, and you have to have a PhD to figure it out. And my patients on the south side of Chicago, they are not going to have they're not going to focus on that because they got other things to worry about. Like, I'm a grandmother raising 3 kids, and I shouldn't have to raise 3 kids, but I'm doing it because of my circumstances. I'm worried about these food deserts. I can't even get quality food in my neighborhood. They now
Wow.
so it's a lot of issues that make people struggle. So our job is to keep it simple. If they eat some ground beef, they've had all they need for the day. You know what I mean? So
That's
keep it simple.
great.
And
Isn't that
not
cool?
everybody has access to someone with a PhD like Ben Bickman.
Exactly. He always brings up, guys, if you didn't get the inside joke, this guy, and I guess me a little bit, we're obsessed with Ben Bickman, but we'll leave it at that.
100%.
We can talk
That's
about him
right.
some more another time.
That's right.
A concept that people really don't understand is, what is insulin resistance? What does that mean? And are
Yeah.
there any warning signs around that?
Yeah, great question, and I appreciate this question because when I decided to call myself the metabolic health doc, my wife was like, "But nobody knows what metabolic health is, right?"
Yes.
And I was like, "Okay, you may be right." And by the way, just as an aside, normal blood pressure, normal blood sugar, triglycerides, which are fats in your blood, are normal. Your good cholesterol, HDL, is normal. And your belly size is, appropriate for your sex, and it should be less than 40 inches in men and less than 35 in women. So if you have 3 out of 5 of those abnormal, you have poor metabolic health. And again, only 7% of Americans are metabolically healthy. But the only way to fix that is to fix your diet. Now, insulin resistance occurs when cells become less responsive to insulin. And when your cells are not responding to insulin, you're going to have a hard time getting that glucose into your cells. And if you can't put them in your cells, it's going to raise your blood sugar.
Okay.
And when your blood sugar is high with too much glucose, it's going to raise your insulin level. Problem with raised insulin levels is that high insulin levels will then cause your arteries to constrict, cause you to hold on to too much salt, and cause inflammation, culminating in 70-80% of all the diseases we worry about. Because if your blood vessels are irritated, inflamed, and constricted, your risk for diabetes and heart disease and stroke and dementia and all these things get worse. And by the way, high
Mm-hmm.
sugars also increase your risk for damage to your nerves. So now you got all the nerves and all the arteries in your body causing all of these things we worry about. So how can I know? So if I'm at the
Mm.
barber shop, and thankfully I don't go to the barber shop anymore because you know what I'm saying? I'm kind
I
of
was going to
sexy with
ask
this,
if
right?
you and Ben Bickman have the same barber.
We do. And it's something we get off of Amazon to cut this crap off. So so it's a beautiful thing. And so what do I see at the barber shop? I'll see a guy with a patch on his neck and it's dark skin, and we call it acanthosis nigricans. That's a sign of insulin resistance.
Okay.
If I see a young person or older person with acne, that's a sign of insulin resistance. The
Wow.
most important part of that metabolic syndrome is the belly, and we call it um, abdominal adiposity. Let's just keep it simple and say a fat belly. And if you have a lot of fat accumulating in your belly, not just under your skin, but around your organs,
Mm-hmm.
that's a sign of insulin resistance. And people who are not, people who are always hungry, believe it or not, like us in the keto community, and obviously carnivore, we don't get hungry because we use that belly fat for fuel. So when we're not eating, we're not craving. So people who are always hungry, talking about like they arrive at work and the first thing they ask, "What we having for lunch?" Those people probably have insulin resistance.
That
And
was us.
yeah, well
We
understood.
were planning our lunch at 8:30 in the morning.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm glad you brought up acne because it speaks to the fact that many people probably don't realize that there are metabolic issues brewing in our
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
young,
that's
well, I want to
right.
say young adults, but kids, these high school, our high school kids. This is, as they're going through puberty, where the acne seems to spring up rampant, and it's important, I think, to identify and acknowledge the fact that insulin resistance can be happening in these young people, even though they're not having other physical health challenges
That's
until
right.
much later in life. To say that
Yeah.
maybe insulin resistance started 10 years
Years.
before or 20
That's
years
right.
before it developed into another metabolic issue like diabetes or fatty liver or heart attack or a stroke or any other issue like this. So uh, insulin resistance, I think, is something that we really need to educate people
That's
on and
right.
Mm-hmm.
understand that this is happening silently, and
Yeah.
Yes. And
we need to bring the education of this issue to the surface and
and
educate people on
and
that.
we need to tell people early on because I want uh, a teenage girl to understand that her irregular periods may be a sign of insulin resistance. Of course, the acne may be a sign. Her oily skin may be a sign.
Mhm.
Having some hair growth on her face may be a sign. Of course, if we did an ultrasound and we saw a lot of cysts on her ovary, polycystic ovarian syndrome, that would be a sign. And that person will then be the person later in life who ends up with um, not only irregular bleeding, but now her risk for fibroids is higher because all that inflammation causes fibroids to occur. Oh, that same person who gets fibroids and had PCOS, acne, is the same person who may then get uterine cancer. It's all the same disease. That's why we need people like Dr. Salcido, Andrea Salcido. She has a YouTube channel called The Conscious Gynecologist, and she only talks about women health, but it
Mm-hmm.
helps women to understand, oh, endometriosis is a metabolic disease. Fibroids is a metabolic disease. So once you start connecting the dots, then you say, oh, instead of just worrying about getting cancer by getting your pap smear and how about if we do some prevention?
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Our diet, then maybe we can reduce the risk of this scary cancer, whether cervical cancer or uterine cancer, by simply changing what we put in our mouth. So it's really a hopeful message that you have a lot of control over your destiny. And that's what I love about this.
Amazing. Thanks for the clarification and the information. That's I'm sure going to help a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
So now over to this is kind of a loaded question, and we talk a lot about type 2 diabetes and how
Mhm.
preventable it is, and other metabolic issues and how preventable they are. But we have the challenge for people who are dealing with type 1 diabetes, and it is a completely different beast. And we know that your wife, Karan, is dealing with type 1 diabetes that was developed later in life. And coincidentally, one of our group members also is dealing with type 1 diabetes and has come to us asking if we could support her and help her. So the first thing we want to know is a ketogenic or a whole food low glycemic way of eating or a carnivore diet something that can benefit a type 1 diabetic? And also, I want to load the question a little more because something that's new to me is the presence of GAD antibodies that
Okay.
are on the rise, potentially in a type 1 diabetic, that are causing the problems. I'm looking to have some education on this issue. So,
That's fair. Well, I think the short answer to this question is uh, low carb, keto, and carnivore diets are very helpful, not just for type 2, but type 1. It wasn't until my wife, Karan, adopted this dietary pattern that she had an improvement in her A1C that she can be proud of. Now, why is that true? Well, it's true because that's why carnivore is a beautiful diet. Because with it is true that if you look at any graph of uh, carbs, protein, and fat,
Mhm.
you'll notice that the carbs raise your blood sugar the most. So we should avoid that. But protein raises your blood sugar a little bit too. It goes from a mountain to a hill.
Mhm.
And what endocrinologists are not taught well, in my opinion, is they don't address the protein. What's cool about eating keto or carnivore, where you're eating animal protein, is that you have to kind of learn. She had to learn, okay, if I eat protein and nothing else, I still have to have some insulin for that because she's type 1 and she doesn't make insulin.
Right.
But she may not take that insulin at the meal. She may actually take it 30 minutes later because the spike occurs later,
Right.
which is
Right.
very interesting. But why don't the endocrinologists know this? I have no clue. So that's number one. Number two is when you go, let's just say somebody's convinced you to eat oatmeal because it has a heart stamp on it, right? I don't know who paid who, but that's what you see.
I
Exactly.
think it was General Mills.
Yeah, that's a pretty good guess, Scott. So now, having said that, if I look at that 28 carbs per serving of oatmeal divided by 4 is 7 teaspoons of sugar. Now I have to assume that I've measured it properly and put it in the, and you're not really measuring, you're making oatmeal for the whole crew, right?
Mm.
So who knows how much oatmeal you're getting, number one. Number two, if it was measured properly, they're allowed to be off by 20%. So
Okay.
is it 28 carbs? Is it 32 carbs? Or is it 24 carbs?
Hmm.
And then you're supposed to match your insulin with that amount. And there's a lot of problems with that because you're not going to get it right.
Right.
Therefore, you're going to end up hyper. If you're lucky, you'll end up where you need to be, but you may be hyperglycemic too high or hypo. So the goal and why keto works is because keto will say, okay, I'm just going to eat an egg omelet. And maybe there's some vegetables, there's, something, some onions or something that's got a few carbs, but I may be eating a 3 carb egg omelet. So now,
Mhm.
is it going to be 3 if I'm off, or 4 or 2? And I don't need a lot of insulin to fix that anyway.
Right.
Right.
So now it's a safer path, and that's why her blood sugars are going to be much better. Now, when it comes to latent onset type 1 diabetes, which is called,
Mhm.
LADA. We abbreviated LADA. That type of diabetes occurs. It's very slow onset for most people. So, and what'll happen, it's kind of a autoimmune disease, and over time, those you mentioned GAD antibodies. That's a
Hmm.
test we can do in the blood to confirm that somebody's attacking the beta cells in the pancreas, and the beta cells are what actually help you create the insulin. So, and it may be a slow process, and in order to know what's going on, you can measure that, but you can also measure something called the C peptide. And the C peptide is an indirect measure of how much insulin you're making. So if I measure that and I notice that level is going down, that could indicate that the pancreas is losing the ability to make enough insulin that you need to keep your blood sugar normal, and you are going from where you were to maybe entering this type 1 diabetes realm, simply meaning that if you don't make insulin, we define that as type 1 diabetes. As you're on your way there, you're kind of in this middle ground state where you can maybe, where you don't have to be on insulin right away, but over time, as you make less and less insulin, you may have to end up on insulin. So people with type 1 tend to require insulin to be okay because they don't make any, and we all need insulin. But if you're on a dietary pattern where you don't have a high demand for insulin because you're eating the low carb foods, ketogenic
Mhm.
foods, carnivore foods, you'll do much better with that. And if you and then you'll have less diabetes distress, which is a term that says if I'm having diabetes distress, that means I'm always worried about my sugars. If I'm an athlete and I want to play sports and things like that, it's hard to always feel good if you're guessing on how much insulin I need because you're eating the oatmeal
Right.
as
Yes.
opposed to eating something that's pretty easy to manage. So in order to reduce what we call a lot of up and down spikes, we call it glycemic variation or variability. You have to tighten it up by eating the right foods that don't require a lot of insulin, etc. And by the way, people with type 2 can be convert to type 1 where
Yes.
they're not making insulin if they are constantly asking the pancreas to
Hmm.
work. And when you eat less starch and sugar with keto or carnivore, your the pancreas is like chilling. It's like on a low carb cruise, like deep, watching Dr. Bigman walk
Yeah.
by.
Hanging out on the walking track.
I
Getting
Hanging out.
love that.
yeah, just chilling.
I absolutely love that.
Yeah, so that's great. So just to say, you can really simplify a type 1 diabetic's life if you eliminate those high glycemic foods.
You can.
Excellent.
Diabetes distress goes
Hmm.
away, and it affects the relationship because if my wife is on a roller coaster, it affects
Yeah.
our
Yeah.
relationship.
Yeah.
So I want her to be stable in a good place. And also, insulin spikes do all kinds of stuff. Your risk for dementia goes up. So you want to really have more stable blood sugars so that you can reduce the risk of things like dementia.
Right.
That's really good to know. In our area, there seems to be like a big push for a plant-based diet. So I would like to know, is plant-based protein as good as animal protein? What are the differences?
Yeah, and I appreciate this question. On the south side of Chicago, uh, there, I have a large African American population, but Dr. Sabi, who was a herbalist who's passed away, who's on YouTube, Dr. Sabi, he promoted a lot of plant-based approaches, which then got into the community, and people are really thinking that's better for them. But
Mhm.
but animal-based protein are superior, going back to like that egg example, because it has all the essential amino acids in one place at the right ratios.
Right.
So that egg is not just, creating a baby chicken, it's the right ratios for humans like us. So where plant proteins are incomplete, and they don't have, that's why you have to combine um, soy with like, soy and pea protein, things like that. You got to eat a whole lot of it and get the right ratios together. And you have to have a PhD. But that's not where it ends. It's just less bioavailable. So when you're having plant proteins, it's harder for your body to get all that protein out, and it's also harder to digest. So I just tell people when it comes to protein. If I were to use Arnold Schwarzenegger as an example, he ate a ton of eggs when he was like this superstar bodybuilder because he knew at the time that that was the best way to build muscle. So,
Mm,
and again, if you're plant based and that's your thing, and you're Hindu and you can't eat animals,
right.
that's fine. You just have to learn how to combine the plants in a way that will allow you to get it close to what we do in the animal based world, but you'll never get the same ratio and the completeness that you can get with an animal-based diet.
When it so when we describe the way of eating that we follow, again back to a whole food low glycemic way of eating, and people often refer to fruit, and fruit is a whole food.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Um, and we hear the argument that that fruit contains natural sugar.
Mhm.
So my question is, does our body know the difference between natural sugar and refined sugar?
No. I
Thank you.
like
Next
your
question.
questions are great because
That was
I
easy.
can just say, "Okay, let's move on."
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Metabolically, And since we're trying to achieve metabolic health, your body doesn't really care.
Mm.
Um, Sugar is going to be broken down into glucose and fructose, and it is what it is. So your body doesn't distinguish between natural sugar and refined sugar. Now, it is true that natural sources of sugar, honey would be an example, have nutrients in it that are not in refined sugar, right?
Right.
And you have some other things in fruit, like fiber, that if you care about fiber, that
Exactly.
would be a win. We don't care about it.
No.
But at the end of the day, what matters is what we talked about previously is the insulin spikes. So if you say to me, Doc, I'm going to hang in a tree like the ape and eat bananas all day. And I tell my patients, you can do that, but you're going to be looking like an ape. Apes are strong. I
Mm.
say, yeah, they're very strong and they got really big bellies.
Mm-hmm.
So if you eat things that, if every banana, every medium banana is 7 teaspoons of sugar, that sugar has to go somewhere. It has to be, and if you're just sitting around in a tree, which is what most people in America and Canada do, we're just not in a tree, but we're hanging out in the office,
Ouch. Yeah.
Exactly.
then we're going to get fat and we're going to raise our insulin levels and we're going to increase our risk for chronic disease. So if you, going back to the continuous glucose monitor, if you eat stuff that spikes your sugar, you're going to continue to have insulin resistance and you're going to continue to live with chronic diseases. So why do that when you have other alternatives like pure monk fruit,
Mm-hmm.
pure stevia, which will have zero impact on your blood sugar and is sweet enough to satisfy a person who has a little bit of a sweet tooth in a moment like that. So we have other choices and we don't have to sacrifice ourselves, our limbs, our
Much.
kidneys, our vision, our hearts, our brains when we have other choices that are actually pretty good. So that's kind of how I would approach it. And I honestly think most of us will do just fine with that approach.
That reminds me of a bit of a crutch we used to do when we were making the transition from our standard diet to a keto diet. It was recommended just some low glycemic fruit in being berries. So
Yes,
blackberries, strawberries, raspberries, and blueberries, in a little bit of heavy cream with some monk fruit sweetener,
Yeah.
and we use that trick not only for ourselves but to help some of the other folks in our groups that were struggling with trying to break that dependence on sugar,
Sugar.
and it works wonders.
Mm-hmm.
that's right.
And then they get to the point where they don't need it anymore. So
No. And you can get the fruit. You can go to any nice restaurant
mhm.
and you look at the fruit menu and say, there's no berries on there. Well, oftentimes if you say, because they may be using berries for something else, right? And you say, is it
Right.
possible I can get some berries with some whipped cream?
Mhm.
Yeah.
And maybe you have to have your own monk fruit, but oftentimes they will have it. And you'll be the only person at the table eating dessert that's unlike everybody else. So always ask,
Yeah,
and
I
you may
like
find that they'll have that. It works too.
great advice.
I love that idea.
Yeah.
I'm gonna do
Yeah.
that next time.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, because we have the little packets of stevia, so we can just
Just
bring
bring
that
it with
along.
you. That's
Yeah.
right.
You talked about this a little before, but our Canadian food guide it tells us to eat a quarter of a plate of healthy grains.
Yes.
Are grains healthy? Are
Are
there
there
some?
are there any healthy grains?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the thing about grains, in fact, many of these grains, if we were to go ancestral with this,
Hmm.
many of these grains we didn't have meals and things like that to even process this stuff, right? So what were the people eating before they had meals? They weren't eating grains. That's for sure. That's the first thing to think about. The other part is going back to, if we use quinoa as an example,
Hmm.
right? And we know that if anybody does a Google search, they'll see that quinoa is about 40 carbs. And if we do the math and divide it by 4, we estimate that's 10 teaspoons of sugar. that's probably not a good idea for a person who does not have metabolic health, particularly borderline diabetes and diabetes. But more importantly, when we think about carbs, protein, and fat, we have essential amino acids and essential fatty acids, meaning that if you don't eat those things, you will die. There's zero essential carbs. What do we mean by that? We mean that carbs are not essential for life. But don't I need sugar for my brain, doctor? Don't I need glucose or sugar? And the answer is you actually do need it, but you can get it from the protein and fat. Your liver will actually convert those things via gluconeogenesis into glucose for you on demand.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I don't have to decide how much steak I eat. I only convert what my brain needs while I'm sleeping. So carbs are not essential. Oh, by the way, grains are carbs. So I don't have to ever eat a grain. And then if I eat a grain, it's going to have those anti-nutrients in it, like phytic acid, which will inhibit any nutrients from the grain from being absorbed in the first place. So we promote it as healthy, but they are nutrient poor compared to animal-based foods, and they will cause blood sugar spikes. And if there's one thing you learn from this entire conversation, you don't want blood sugar spikes.
Right.
You don't want hyperinsulinemia where your insulin just stays high. So it's best for most people to avoid grains altogether. And I like Vinny, shout out to Vinny Tortorich with his no sugars, no grains concept that he has, uh, NS, whatever that acronym is, hashtag. I think that's a good approach. Avoid the grains and avoid the sugars, and you'll probably live a longer life.
Perfect. Tony,
Mm,
we're really happy for all the information that you shared with us today. It's been, I'm sure it'll be eye opening. You've taught us quite a bit on some new topics.
mm-hmm.
But we want to ask you what you would suggest to someone who is new to this way of eating, would like to
Yeah.
try a keto or carnivore way of eating. Where do they start?
Yeah. Well, you want to keep it simple. So there's a lot of definitions. In America, 250 to 350 carbs per day is what's normal. And if you divide it by four, man, 100 divided by four is 25 teaspoons of sugar. So you don't want to eat all that sugar, right? So, number one, understand the concept of reducing the amount of carbs that you're consuming. Low carb can start as high as 120 if you're doing 300, right? Keto starts in the 50 range, and most people like myself, Dr. Eric Westman, and others would say get it under 20 or 30 a day. And I would say total carbs instead of net. Net means you subtract the fiber from that number, you subtract the sugar alcohols. These are things in packages. Most of
Mm-hmm.
my patients eat on the outside of the grocery store. So start shopping on the outer part of the grocery store. It's okay to go in for a little mustard and things like that, but try to shop where the meat and the non-starchy vegetables are. It's okay to use cans if it's convenient. As long as it's a non-starchy vegetable, it's okay to do frozen vegetables. That's okay. Uh, and so the concept is very simple. Shop on the outside of the grocery store. Try to avoid processed foods, which will eliminate most of the things in boxes. Try to avoid sugars and grains, like we just talked about. And even though it's controversial, try to avoid seed oils because they can be inflammatory, and ease into it to make it as simple as possible. Eat animal protein and non-starchy vegetables. Avoid fruit. If you eat fruit, eat the berries because those are the ones that are less likely to be a problem. And if you want to be more animal based, carnivore ish, make sure your animals are fatty. We do
Mm-hmm.
better with fatty things. We can also add fat on top of it, like bacon grease and things like that, which sounds crazy. Lamb is fatty. Salmon's pretty fatty. Ribeye is fatty. Try to eat, and organ meats are great. So just keep it simple. And then if you struggle, if you have a cramp or so, if you're trying to become adaptive, you may have to make sure you're hydrated, but more importantly, you may need electrolytes. But this is, and maybe start with one thing at a time. Okay, this week I'm going to eliminate processed food. Next week, I'm going to make sure I don't do grains. Next week, ease into this and your life will change. So I really hope that more people learn these messages. That's why I'm so happy you guys will be a voice out here spreading this so that more people can heal and not live with these chronic diseases.
Wonderful. Tony, I'm sure that you've piqued the curiosity of some of our members, and I'm sure they're going to be hungry for more information, more knowledge that can be acquired from people like you who are professionals in the healthcare industry. So, where can people find you?
Well, I'll say if they search Dr. Tony Hampton on YouTube, they'll see my YouTube channel.
Mhm.
But I also have a link tree, and the link tree, Dr. Tony Hampton link tree, if you search that, that'll give you access to my video, how to do low carb, why do low carb, how to get started on carnivore, and also my 2-page handout for those who are just doing low carb. Eat one side is what to eat, the other side what not to eat. And you can print that from
Nice.
the website. So I think those are great resources and some other links on there that I try to share with people.
Perfect.
Thank you so, so much for taking the time to talk to us today. We so appreciate your time and your expertise. We know you're a very, very busy person, so that it means so much to us, and we're very grateful.
And what we want everyone to remember is that meat heals.
Carb steel.
That's right.
Thanks again, Dr. Tony.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys.